Sandra is a leading global authority and prolific author on international water issues. She has written on irrigation and water scarcity, as well as new approaches to harmonizing human and ecosystem needs for fresh water. In Rivers for Life, Managing Water for Nature and People, which I must say is one of the most important books that I've read in my career on freshwater. Sandra has also addressed environmental issues for leaders around the world, including the European Parliament, and we are very privileged to have her here with us tonight. Sandra?
Thanks, Tony. It's a wonderful introduction, and I want to also thank you and the rest of your team at WWF-Canada here for inviting me to join you this evening. It's a great privilege for me to be with you tonight. First, I want to allay some concerns that you might have. I am an American, but I promise you I'm not here to steal your water. Okay, so just get that one off the table. I think it's really clear that the human story over the next half century is very much going to be a water story. And I think many of us in this room will have opportunities to shape that story in ways that can profoundly influence the future of our human society over the next few decades and beyond. And we're already beginning to see glimpses of how this is going to potentially take place in the form of extreme floods and droughts and food crises and water shortages. We're beginning to see how the water cycle and changes in the water cycle and water supplies are already influencing these dynamics. It seems very clear to me that we're at one of those hinge points in human history where the decisions we make over the next decade or so will greatly influence the trajectory of our civilization as we go forward. Water is finite, right? And it's the basis of life. And so this challenge, as I like to frame it in my mind, is a really big one. And it's figuring out how we're going to meet the needs, the food needs, the water needs, the energy needs of 7 billion people, 8 billion people by 2025, 9 billion people by 2050, while we sustain the freshwater ecosystems that support life on Earth and support the aquatic ecosystems that sustain everything. And this is a very big challenge. It's not just an environmental challenge. It's not just a water challenge. It's a very broad societal challenge that will engage all of us in some form or another, in whatever walk of life we happen to be in. So I wanted to say a few words about this challenge, the dimensions of it, and how we might need to think about moving forward in a different way if we're going to have a shot at meeting it. We have done an extraordinary job of turning water into a productive resource over 5,000 years of settled agriculture and irrigated agriculture. We've clearly done a remarkable job at this, growing food, manufacturing clothes and cars and steel and all manner of things in this room, providing drinking water for a growing population. And this hasn't always been easy. You know, water's not always where we need it, when we need it. And so it's taken an enormous amount of planning and infrastructure to be able to meet all of these needs. It's hard to imagine, I think, our world of 7 billion people today, $70 trillion in goods and services exchanged every year without water engineering, right? Dams to store water and canals to move it around and giant pumps to bring it up from underneath the earth. It's hard for me anyway to imagine this world without all of this water engineering. But we're hitting some limits to that approach, and we're beginning to see some clear evidence of this on the ground, that there's trouble ahead in proceeding with this approach that we've been on. And I'm sure many of you know these stories. We read about it in the news all the time, that rivers are running dry. Big rivers are running dry for extended periods of time, right? The Indus River in South Asia, major river for Pakistan. The Murray in Australia. The Ganges even, from time to time, in South Asia. In my neck of the woods, the Colorado and the Rio Grande, the Nile. These are big rivers that sustain hundreds of millions of people, tens of millions of irrigated acres of land that are routinely running dry for extended periods of time. We're building up a large water deficit in the form of groundwater overpumping. And this is sort of an out-of-sight, out-of-mind problem, but one that I think is going to be very, very influential in how we go forward with our food production and all manner of other water activities. If you look around the world now, large portions of China, India, the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, the western United States, you find groundwater is being overpumped. We're pulling out more water from aquifers than is naturally being recharged. The best estimates we can pull together suggest that as much as 10% of our current food supply today depends on the overpumping of groundwater. So in a sense, we're propping up our food supply today with an unsustainable use of water, which raises questions about how we're going to meet the food needs of 8 billion, 9 billion people down the road. And I would bet that in North America, both the United States and especially Canada are probably going to be called upon to help meet more of the world's food needs in the future, even than is being met today, in part because of this problem. China, India, largely self-sufficient in food, are beginning to hit their water limits, and it shows up in their rivers and it shows up in their groundwater. And so water scarcity is increasingly going to be impacting the food supply and international grain trade and grain prices. And we've begun to see glimpses of this over the last couple of years. And the third thing we're seeing is a large-scale decline in the health of freshwater ecosystems. The way we've gone about meeting most of these demands has been to go out and find and build more and larger water projects, especially large dams and river diversions. If you look back to 1950, we had about 5,000 large dams around the world. Today we have 50,000 large dams around the world. So we've been building, on average, about 2 large dams a day, every day for half a century, which is a very, very large change in the hydrologic environment in a very, very short period of time. I mean, 50 years is a geologic twinkling of an eye. And we know what dams do economically, very important services we get from large dams: hydropower, flood control, irrigation, water supply. Very important benefits economically. But if you think about what a dam is doing ecologically, and we didn't think a lot about this when they were built, right? They're in a sense doing 2 important things. They're disconnecting a river from important parts of the rest of the system. So a river is disconnected from its floodplain. It's disconnected from its own channel. It's disconnected from the delta downstream into which the river, and the sea into which the river empties. So all of these disconnections result in a loss of ecosystem services, and I'm going to talk about that for a minute. The other thing that dams are doing are changing the natural flow regime of the river. Every river has a signature flow regime. It has a rhythm of highs and lows and floods and droughts that all of the species in that river system have become adapted to over time, over thousands of years, if not millions of years. And so as dams begin to change those flow patterns, all the life within those rivers are losing critical things they need. They're losing habitats, they're losing food sources, they're losing their life cycle cues, their cues to migrate, their cues to spawn. And so what we see now is, as a result of this, there's a tremendous freshwater biodiversity crisis going on as we speak. Hard to get solid estimates, but it seems that the rates of extinction of freshwater life are 4 to 6 times greater than terrestrial or marine species. In North America, we've got 40% of our freshwater fish to some degree at risk of extinction. 4 in 10 species of fish in North America to some degree at risk of extinction. In the United States, which ranks first in the world in the number of known species of freshwater mussels, 69% at risk of extinction. We have a nickname for freshwater mussels. We call them living filters because they do such a great job of filtering water, cleansing water, tremendous for keeping our supplies clean and healthy. And 69% of those species are at risk of extinction to some degree. So in a sense, this web of life that sustains everything in freshwater and everything dependent on freshwater, which includes us, is fraying as a result largely of these changes to natural river systems. And of course, it's not only species that we're losing, but the services that this web of life provides to us. If you think about healthy watersheds and wetlands, I like to think of them as nature's water factories. You know, wetlands and healthy watersheds are purifying water and churning out reliable supplies for all kinds of human water needs. If you think about floodplains that are still connected to rivers, they're helping control floods and store water in many ways cheaper and better than levees and dams are doing in a lot of locations. If you think about wetlands, tremendous habitat benefits, but also water storage. So all of these services have become very much at risk as we've gone about changing these water systems. And of course, we rarely take these services into account as we make decisions about how to manage land and water. We don't bring them into commercial markets. There's no way to put a monetary value on them most of the time. So we're losing them at a pretty rapid rate as we go about our development. And of course, on top of all this, we have this wild card of climate change, which overlays all these other stresses. All of this would be here even if climate change wasn't happening. But now we have this additional major stress, this additional stress of climate change on top of it all. And hydrologists are telling us now that we really can't expect the past to be a reliable guide to the future. There's a foundational concept in hydrology called stationarity, which basically says, yes, systems vary, but they vary within knowable boundaries. The variation occurs within knowable boundaries. And what they're telling us is that stationarity is dead, that we're now moving outside this envelope of the familiar into unfamiliar terrain. And so we're going to see more extremes of all kinds, more extreme floods, more extreme droughts. And we're seeing signs of this already. I've been on Lake Mead in the western United States a couple times in the last couple years, and it's an astonishing sight. I mean, Lake Mead is the biggest reservoir in the United States. It supplies nearly as many people as live in all of Canada, supplies 1 million acres of irrigated land, and there's a huge white bathtub ring all around it. It's dropped 100 feet in the last 8 or so years, and there's now a considerable risk that this major water supply will hit dead pool within 10 years, and that perhaps even before then, we won't be able to generate hydropower at Hoover Dam. I mean, this is what illuminates Las Vegas, water supply for Phoenix and Tucson and Los Angeles, and we haven't begun to prepare for what we've always considered an unthinkable situation, but now seems like it's going to happen, maybe within the next 10 years. We haven't begun to really prepare for this. We can look at the Aral Sea in Central Asia, which is shrinking, right? All kinds of signs that we're beginning to move outside of this knowable set of boundaries. So this is a very challenging picture, I think. And so the question is, what do we do? Given what's happening, what do we do with this? And I think back to the great physicist Albert Einstein's reminder that you can't solve a big problem within the same mindset that created the problem. That if you're going to solve a big problem like this, you've got to somehow get outside the mindset that created the problem. And if you think about the mindset that we've been operating under, it's really one that says water has value only when you extract it from its natural place in the environment and put it to work on a farm, in a factory, in a home. That water in its natural place doesn't have value. And so that sort of operating assumption has brought us to where we are, with a lot of depleted rivers, with a lot of overpumped groundwater aquifers. That sense that its value is only there when you extract it and put it to use. The new approach, I think, flips that around. And it basically begins to put water's most fundamental role, which is as the basis of life, at the core of how we use and manage and value and think about water. And it sounds like we should have done this from the beginning. Water is absolutely a resource for doing all the things I've been talking about. Hydropower, flood control, hydropower, water supply, irrigation. But most fundamentally, it's the basis of life on the planet. And there's no substitute for it. So that really is the fundamental function of water. And so what about putting that fundamental function as the core of how we use and manage and think about and value water? What would this look like from a water management standpoint? What would this look like? Basically, it would mean putting some kind of a limit or a cap on the degree to which we let healthy systems, healthy river systems and watersheds degrade and lose their functions. Because if we do that, we're not going to be sustaining the web of life. And so it flips it around and says, water's place in nature, the work that it's doing in the natural environment, needs to be safeguarded first. And then we manage and allocate water around that. And this is a fundamental change. And Brian Richter and I, in writing the book that Tony kindly mentioned in introducing me, we called this concept of a sustainability boundary. In other words, we're defining a limit beyond which we don't want to go because we lose value if we go beyond it. We lose the natural work that nature's doing. And so we need to begin to incorporate that. And this sustainability boundary does two things, two really important things. In economic terms, it actually maximizes the value of water because you're accounting for not only the extractive uses, but the in-stream uses. You're actually taking both of them into account. And the second thing it does is that it creates a lot of incentive to drive up water productivity, to get more benefit from each liter of water we extract from the natural environment. Because if you've said we have to leave this in place to sustain nature, it tells us how much we have to work with then. And it's going to force productivity and force conservation and force efficiency up. And all kinds of creative ways will do that. And this is the missing piece right now, I think, in water management, that we don't have that incentive to do better with less water, to get more crop per drop, to meet our needs with less water. And we know we can do it. We can see it in a lot of different areas where those incentives do exist, that it can be done. Tony mentioned South Africa as a good example. South Africa had a sort of unique situation with a new constitution after the apartheid government fell and the Mandela government came in, and they rewrote their constitution and rewrote their water law. And it's the most progressive thing you can find anywhere in the world on paper. And it basically says a lot of things, but the one important thing for our discussion is that it sets up a water reserve, and it says all people need to have the water that they need for their good health provided to them. But it also says that all ecosystems also need the flows that they need for good health and good functioning. And this is a dramatic departure from that old approach that not only people but ecosystems are going to get the flows they need to sustain their health and functioning. Last month, Australia came out with a very, very interesting and progressive policy on the Murray-Darling River Basin, where they're beginning to come out with new allocations of water that are dramatically lower than the allocations that farmers and others in the basin have been used to in order to begin returning water to the natural environment. They're investing something like $3 billion in buying back water rights in order to put water back into rivers and back into wetlands. And the farmers there are beginning to realize that they're going to have to adapt to a new normal when it comes to water. 10 years of drought in Australia, I think, shook everybody up. And they began to realize if we want to have a healthy economy and a healthy environment coexist side by side, we're going to have to adapt and do some things dramatically differently. And it's going to be painful. Farmers there are protesting. When I was there in June, there was a lot of anxiety about what this was going to look like. But also, I think, a recognition that this is necessary, that there's going to have to be a major adaptation. So we're beginning to see this. We're also beginning to see some regions go back and look at their infrastructure. In a sense, we've been master plumbers of the earth. We've been building these dams and diversions, and there's all this plumbing out there, but we haven't put into place the ecological intelligence we've acquired to operate this plumbing differently, to be able to give rivers back the flows that they need. In the United States, we've had some really good pilot efforts in this regard, largely thanks to the Nature Conservancy working with the Army Corps of Engineers, which is one of the big federal dam managers. The Army Corps manages 600 dams across the country. And TNC and the Army Corps entered into a partnership in 2002 to look at about 8 different river basins and something like 36 different dams to ask the question, can we continue to meet hydropower and flood control and recreation and water supply needs, but also give the river some of the flows back that it needs to be healthy? And as we've begun to ask that question, we realize the answer is often yes, if we just ask. That if you begin to look at how you can reoperate the dam, provide flows at certain times when species in the river, when the ecosystem in the river needs those flows, in the quality, the quantity, the timing of those flows that make those systems healthy, you often can do it. And there's, it seems, considerable low-hanging fruit out there if you just ask the question. One example on the Green River in Kentucky, which was one of the first dams piloted under this partnership, we're beginning, it seems, to see mussel populations come back that had been declining for decades. At the same time, the ability to use the reservoirs there for recreation has actually expanded. And habitat in Mammoth Cave, which draws something like 2.5 million tourists every year, has been improved. And so there's been improvement all around as a result of this to ask the question. And we have in the United States 1,932 large dams on rivers that are taxpayer-funded dams, federal-funded dams, federally managed dams. So imagine if we went, dam by dam, river by river, watershed by watershed, and asked that question. I think we would get an awful lot of river restoration, an awful lot of ecological health restored if we did this systematically, and we're beginning to work toward that goal. Of course, the other important piece of this, and I won't hold you up much longer, the other important piece of this is making sure there's water to share with nature, right? There's one thing about managing the flows in rivers, which is exceedingly important, but the other is to make sure there's water in the system to work with. And increasingly, that's not the case. And so this gets at the human water footprint, that if we're going to meet all these needs and still have water remaining to keep natural systems healthy, we're going to have to do something about our water footprint. And that is shrinking the amount of water it takes to sustain the human population. And we're going to need it pretty much across the board. And again, as we look around, we see positive signs that this is doable. We're beginning to see in agriculture moves toward more drip irrigation, getting more crop per drop. And again, drawing this sustainability boundary is the key, because once you do that, you provide incentives for conservation and efficiency and ways to do more with less. So that's the key thing. In my old neck of the woods in Massachusetts, we had a great example of Boston, which ran into the classic example of a city, demand rising, hitting the safe yield of the supply, and they began to look for a new water source, what every city would do in that situation, right? This was back in about 25 years ago, back in the mid-'80s. And they were going to divert more water from the Connecticut River, which is the biggest river in New England. And the citizens said, hey, wait a minute. We're working on fisheries restoration in the Connecticut. We're not so keen on this diversion. Can we look at conservation and see what we could do through demand management? And the Water Authority took it to heart, and lo and behold, within a matter of years, water demand in the greater Boston area, 2 million people, began to come down. And in 2004, I was astonished. An email came across my desk that said water use in the greater Boston area was back to where it was 50 years ago. And it had dropped 43% from its peak. There was no need for the diversion from the Connecticut River. The reservoir that supplies Boston was brimming with water such that the authority had to make a choice. Do they expand their service area, or do they maybe restore the Swift River, which was the river that was dammed to create the reservoir to supply Boston in the first place? So a total win-win, and it saved Boston consumers money because the big expensive diversion, the capital project, wasn't needed. The conservation program was considerably less expensive. So a really good example, and not an isolated one. We now have, a half dozen, maybe a dozen cities that have substantially reduced their water use as a result of these kinds of efforts. My sense is we're going to need something like a doubling or tripling of water productivity to meet that goal, right, of sustaining the human population of 7-8 billion people while also protecting aquatic ecosystems. A doubling or tripling of water productivity, getting twice or 3 times as much benefit out of each gallon or liter of water we extract from the natural environment. And I think we can do this. Individuals often ask me, what can I do? Here I am, I'm an individual, it's a big global problem, what can I do? And they say, I turn off the faucet when I'm brushing my teeth, what more can I do? And this is where I think helping people understand how much water it takes to sustain their own lifestyle can be very, very empowering, because it gives people a lot more that they can do when they think about all the things that go on in their life that take water. The average North American is directly or indirectly taking about 2,000 gallons of water a day. What is that? About 8,000, little under 7,600 liters of water a day to sustain their lifestyle. And more than half of that is our diet. So thinking about food, 35% is energy, 10% is made up of what's coming out of your tap at home and the material goods that we have, our clothes and books and computers and so on, the things we don't use every day but buy periodically throughout the year. That's a lot of water, and a lot of changes that we can make as consumers, that anyone can make if they choose to be part of this solution. We were really surprised at National Geographic. We spent a couple months this summer building a new water calculator to help people understand their water footprint. And we put it up, I think it was in early August, and within 60 days, we'd had nearly 750,000 page views on this calculator. So it said to us, people really want to know. They're curious, one, what is this water footprint thing? You know, they think about their water use at home, but not about the water that's embedded in their hamburger, in their coffee, in their clothes, in their everyday life. They wanted to understand that and know about it. But secondly, I think it showed that they really want to get engaged, and that this was a way that people could feel part of the bigger set of solutions. So this is, I think, a huge challenge, and it's going to take an awful lot of work. But the good news is that I think if we take the best of what's happening, the best of what we can see happening there, out in the world, and multiply it many times, we could get to that more positive vision of a world in which we're in much better balance with ecosystems. It's a world that's more resilient, more beautiful, more productive in lots of ways, and a world we would want to pass on to our generations coming along. Canada is blessed with an enormous amount of water, has the possibility of a legacy of passing on some of the last remaining beautiful free-flowing rivers you can find anywhere in the world. So the opportunity here in Canada is extraordinary. And I think in North America, together Canada and the US could really lead on this issue if we made it a high priority. I think the opportunity is great, the responsibility is equally great, and I hope that we can all in this room work together to make this happen. Thanks so much for your attention.